Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Palermo in the 1920s. The streets are narrow, winding, and alive with the sounds of merchants, carts, and the voices of people going about their daily business. The scent of bread fresh from village ovens mixes with the salty air from the nearby sea. This is Sicily, an island both beautiful and scarred, a land of history, tradition, and struggle. It is here, on July 13th, 1928, that Tommaso Buscetta is born. A child who at first glance seems like any other, but in the shadows of his childhood lies the shape of a destiny tied to the Sicilian Mafia. Cosa Nostra. Tommaso is the youngest of 17 children. His family is poor, like so many in Sicily during this time. Poverty isn't just an inconvenience. It is a force that pushes people toward choices they might otherwise never consider. For many boys in Palermo, there are two paths: live quietly in hardship or step into the underworld where power, respect, and money might be earned. The Mafia, with all of its danger and allure, was never far from the streets Tommaso walked as a boy. He grew up watching men in fine suits, men whose presence carried both fear and admiration. They weren't elected officials, and they didn't wear uniforms, yet their authority was unquestionable. These were men of Cosa Nostra, the secret society that had already taken root deep into Sicily's soil. As a child, Tommaso isn't much different from his peers. He is restless, curious, and aware that life offers him little. School is not his passion. Instead, he is drawn to the hum of the city, to the charisma of men who speak softly but are obeyed without question. The Mafia, for a boy like Tommaso, is not some distant idea. It is woven into daily life. When disputes arise, people don't always go to the police. They turn to men of honor. When businesses need protection, or when money must change hands, these men stand at the center of it all. Tommaso begins to understand early that respect in Sicily is not just earned through honesty or hard work. Respect often comes through fear, power, and association. By his teenage years, Tommaso is already dipping his feet into this world. He isn't a boss or a decision maker, but he learns quickly. He sees how Cosa Nostra operates in silence. There are no grand speeches, no shouting matches in public. Power is maintained through whispers, through a look across the table, through promises that are both binding and unspoken. Silence, omertà, is the golden rule. To speak outside the circle, to betray the family, is to invite death not just for yourself, but for those you love. And in this environment, young Tommaso begins his journey, one step at a time, into the brotherhood of the Mafia. His early years are marked by charm. Even before he rises to any significant position, he is known for his manners, his polished appearance, and his ability to win people over. Unlike the brutish stereotype of a gangster, Tommaso prefers elegance. He dresses in fine suits even when he cannot afford them. He presents himself as a man who belongs in higher circles. This charm is not an accident. It becomes his tool, his armor, and eventually his reputation. People remember him not as a thug in the streets, but as a gentleman who happens to walk in dark company. But beneath the polished exterior lies a restless spirit. Sicily, while home, feels suffocating at times. The island is small, the opportunities limited, and the weight of mafia politics can be dangerous. For many Sicilian gangsters, exile abroad offers escape and expansion. America, Canada, South America, these lands are fertile ground for mafia networks. And Tommaso, always eager to move forward, looks beyond the streets of Palermo. Yet before he leaves, he learns firsthand the brutality of the life he has chosen. By the 1940s and 1950s, mafia wars are already brewing in Sicily. Families fight over territory, over smuggling routes, over money. Tommaso witnesses death not as an exception, but as part of daily existence. Men disappear, bodies turn up in ditches, families are destroyed overnight. Still, he remains loyal. For Tommaso, in these early years, Cosa Nostra is not just an organization. It is a code of belonging. It is a way to transform poverty into power. And above all, it is a matter of identity. Once you are part of the Mafia, you are no longer just yourself. You are a soldier, a representative of something larger than you. As he grows into adulthood, Tommaso marries and starts a family of his own. His personal life, however, becomes tangled with his criminal one. Multiple marriages, complicated relationships, and the strain of Mafia obligations create fractures. Yet through it all, Tommaso maintains his polished surface. He is charming even when chaos surrounds him. He is respected even when mistakes are made. For those who know him, he seems almost untouchable. But beneath the surface, the fractures are already forming. By the 1960s, Tommaso's name is known far beyond Palermo. He becomes involved in international drug trafficking, one of the Mafia's most profitable and dangerous enterprises. This business connects him not only to Sicilian families, but to criminal networks across continents. Brazil, the United States, and other lands become part of his map. For Tommaso, travel is not luxury, it is survival. Each move, each connection, ties him deeper into a web that stretches far beyond Sicily. But even as he expands his reach, he cannot escape the shadows of Palermo. Cosa Nostra, after all, is not forgiving. Its rules are strict, its punishments merciless. The life Tommaso has chosen demands everything: his loyalty, his silence, and sometimes even his family. And so, the stage is set. Tommaso Buscetta, born a poor boy in Palermo, has risen to become more than just another gangster. He is charming, well-dressed, and connected. He is respected, feared, and in some ways envied. But he is also haunted. Haunted by the violence around him, by the loss of loved ones, and by the slow realization that the honor he once believed in may not truly exist. This is where his story begins. Not with betrayal, not with courtroom drama, but with a boy who became a man shaped by the streets of Sicily. A man who sought belonging and found it in the shadows. A man who would one day shatter the silence he once swore to uphold. Tommaso Buscetta's journey is not one of sudden twists, but of gradual breaking. And it all starts here, in the quiet streets of Palermo, where a child of poverty stepped into a world of power, charm, and eventually betrayal. In the years following World War II, Sicily was a land of contradictions. On one hand, the island struggled with poverty, political instability, and the scars of war. On the other, it pulsed with opportunities for those willing to cross into the shadows. The Mafia thrived in this climate. With the old structures of power weakened, Cosa Nostra filled the void, deciding disputes, controlling markets, and shaping destinies with a whisper rather than a shout. For a young man like Tommaso Buscetta, these were years of possibility. Dangerous possibility, but possibility nonetheless. By the time he reached his 20s, Tommaso had already chosen his direction. He would not be a fisherman, nor a factory worker, nor a man who accepted poverty as fate. Instead, he leaned deeper into the world of the Mafia. He began with small errands, running messages, building trust, learning when to speak, and more importantly, when to stay silent. His charm and appearance separated him from the average recruit. He wasn't the kind of man who intimidated with fists. He impressed with presence. To many of his superiors, this made him valuable. Respect and loyalty could be commanded through fear, but admiration was far rarer. And Tommaso had a gift for being admired. It was during these years that Tommaso began to understand the true meaning of Cosa Nostra. To outsiders, the Mafia might have seemed like a criminal gang, an organization obsessed with money, power, and intimidation. But to those inside, it was presented as something nobler, an institution of honor. The word mafia was never spoken openly. Instead, members referred to themselves as men of honor. It was a society bound by ritual secrecy and a code of silence called omertà. To break that silence was not just betrayal. It was the ultimate sin, one punishable by death without hesitation. Tommaso absorbed these rules with the devotion of a believer. He took the oath seriously, believing that within the mafia there was a higher form of justice, one separate from the corrupt and often powerless state. In a land where the government failed to protect its people, the mafia offered order. It was violent order, yes, but to many, it was preferable to chaos. And so Tommaso served faithfully, never questioning the contradictions that simmered beneath the surface. His real entry into power came through smuggling. Sicily, positioned between Europe, Africa, and the Mediterranean, was a perfect hub for illicit trade. Cigarettes, liquor, and other goods flowed in and out, and Tommaso became skilled at managing these routes. Smuggling was less bloody than other mafia ventures, but it demanded intelligence, coordination, and trust. It was here that Tommaso's natural talents shone. He was a negotiator, a mediator, a man who could move between worlds. He wore the face of respectability while building a foundation in crime. As the 1950s unfolded, another, more dangerous opportunity emerged: heroin trafficking. For Cosa Nostra, this was the golden business. The profits were astronomical, the risks high, but the rewards irresistible. Tommaso was drawn into this international network, one that connected Sicily to the United States, Brazil, and beyond. He became a vital link in the chain, managing shipments, forging alliances, and ensuring the smooth flow of product across borders. The man who once wandered the streets of Palermo now dealt in fortunes measured by kilos of white powder. This expansion brought Tommaso to Brazil, a country that would play a crucial role in his life. Brazil offered distance from the violent struggles of Sicily, a chance to build operations in relative safety. Yet even here, the shadow of the mafia loomed large. Exile never meant escape, it meant extension. The families in Palermo still held power over him, and every move he made was watched, evaluated, and weighed. Brazil was a new stage, but the same play continued. What set Tommaso apart in these years was not brutality, but adaptability. Many mafia men relied on fear and violence to maintain their position. Tommaso preferred persuasion. He was diplomatic, often resolving conflicts through conversation rather than bloodshed. This approach earned him the nickname, the boss of two worlds, a man who could bridge the gap between Sicilian tradition and international ambition. He became known for his elegance, always well dressed, always composed, always the gentleman gangster. But beneath the polished surface, there was tension. To rise in the mafia meant to accumulate enemies as quickly as allies. Each success brought jealousy. Each alliance carried the seeds of betrayal. In his personal life, too, Tommaso lived in extremes. He married multiple times, fathered children, and tried to balance the demands of family with the relentless pull of his criminal life. His wives and children often suffered for his choices, living in fear or in exile, caught between love for a father and husband and the danger that followed his name. Tommaso himself seemed torn, capable of great affection, but often absent, distracted, or consumed by the demands of Cosa Nostra. The mafia promised belonging, but it also devoured those closest to him. This would become one of the great tragedies of his life. The 1960s were a turning point. Within Cosa Nostra, rivalries deepened. The rise of the heroin trade brought immense wealth, but also immense conflict. Families fought bitterly for control of the roots and profits. Violence escalated in Palermo, and Tommaso, despite his preference for diplomacy, could not escape the storm. He became a target, and at times a fugitive. Arrests and imprisonments punctuated his career, moments where his polished exterior cracked under the weight of law enforcement. Yet even in prison, he carried himself as a man of honor, never speaking against his comrades, never betraying the oath of silence. At least, not yet. Looking back, one might wonder, when did the fracture begin? At what point did Tommaso, the loyal soldier, begin to doubt the code he had once embraced? The answer is not simple. It was not a single event, not a sudden revelation. It was a slow erosion, like stone worn down by years of water. Each betrayal by his so-called brothers, each loss of a loved one, each glimpse of hypocrisy within Cosa Nostra chipped away at his faith. The mafia that promised honor delivered only grief. But in these early years, Tommaso still believed, or at least convinced himself he did. He wore his suits, built his networks, and played the role of the gentleman gangster. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The man who would one day betray the mafia was, at this stage, still its loyal servant. But loyalty in Cosa Nostra was a fragile thing. And for Tommaso Buscetta, the shadows of Palermo and the streets of Brazil were only the beginning of a journey that would end not with silence, but with confession. The 1960s brought change to Sicily, change that was violent, ruthless, and inevitable. What began as disputes over smuggling routes and power balances quickly spiraled into full-blown war. The streets of Palermo, once merely shadowed by the presence of Cosa Nostra, became battlefields where silence was shattered by gunfire and explosions. For Tommaso Buscetta, who had built a reputation as a gentleman gangster and international operator, these years tested not only his loyalty, but his very survival. At the heart of the conflict was greed. The mafia had always been about power, but now, with heroin trafficking bringing unimaginable profits, the stakes had never been higher. Families that had coexisted uneasily for decades turned on one another. Old friendships dissolved. Trust, already scarce, vanished entirely. The first mafia war erupted in the early 1960s, a storm of betrayals and killings that sent shockwaves through Sicily. Palermo became a city where death was expected, not feared. Bombs destroyed homes, bullets cut men down in broad daylight, and families mourned without hope of justice. Buscetta, with his international connections, tried to navigate these dangerous waters carefully. He was never the most violent of mafiosi. He preferred subtlety to brute force, diplomacy to bloodshed. But in a war like this, neutrality was impossible. Allegiances were demanded, and survival often depended on making choices that carried lifelong consequences. He aligned himself with certain families, tried to maintain his influence, and, whenever possible, sought refuge abroad. Brazil became his escape, a place where he could continue business with some degree of safety, even as Palermo drowned in violence. Yet, no matter how far he traveled, Sicily reached him. Arrests, extraditions, and constant suspicion followed him across borders. In 1963, after one of the bloodiest bombings in mafia history, the Sicily massacre, law enforcement cracked down heavily on Cosa Nostra. Dozens of mafiosi were arrested, and Tommaso found himself caught in the sweep. Though he would be released and continue his activities, it was a reminder that his elegant facade could not protect him forever. The law, though often powerless, was not blind, and the mafia wars ensured that police attention was unavoidable. The Sicily bombing marked more than just state retaliation. It marked the beginning of Buscetta's growing disillusionment. The mafia had always presented itself as an organization of honor, bound by tradition and silent respect. But what he saw around him was far from honorable. Families turned against each other not because of principle, but because of money. Men of supposed dignity betrayed their closest allies for power. The code of silence, once sacred, became a tool not of loyalty, but of fear. And for Tommaso, who had given his faith to this system, the cracks in belief began to spread. His personal life suffered deeply during these years. Tommaso was a man of many relationships, marriages, and children, but the mafia always came first. His families lived in uncertainty, moving from place to place, sometimes with him, often without. His children grew up in the shadows of his reputation, forced to carry the burden of his choices. Some would later pay the ultimate price for his allegiance to Cosa Nostra. For now, though, they remained close, clinging to their father, even as his world became more dangerous. By the 1970s, Tommaso had already lived a life of extremes. He had tasted wealth, influence, and admiration, but he had also endured prison, exile, and the constant threat of death. Still, he remained loyal. Despite his doubts, despite the hypocrisy he witnessed, he clung to the belief that the mafia could still embody something more than greed. Perhaps it was denial, perhaps it was habit, or perhaps it was the fear of admitting that the life he had dedicated himself to was, in the end, hollow. The Second Mafia War, beginning in the late 1970s, pushed Buscetta closer to the edge. This conflict was even bloodier than the first. The Corleonesi, a faction of the mafia led by ruthless men such as Tote Rina, rose to dominance through sheer brutality. Unlike the older generation, who maintained at least a veneer of tradition, the Corleonesi had no patience for subtlety. They killed not only rivals but entire families, wiping out bloodlines to secure their power. It was a campaign of terror, and Palermo once again became a city under siege. For Tommaso, these years were devastating. Many of his friends and allies were slaughtered. Worse still, his own family became targets. Two of his sons, Benedetto and Antonio, were brutally murdered in 1982. The killings were not just acts of war, they were messages. No one was untouchable. No one was safe, not even the children of a loyal soldier. For Tommaso, the grief was unbearable. He had always known that violence was part of mafia life, but nothing could have prepared him for the pain of losing his sons. Their deaths marked a turning point, one that would echo through the rest of his life. The mafia demanded loyalty, yet it offered no protection. It claimed to be a family, yet it destroyed his own. The ideals that had drawn him in as a young man, the sense of belonging, of honor, of brotherhood, were now ashes. In their place stood only blood, betrayal, and exhaustion. Tommaso's faith in Cosa Nostra, once unshakable, was breaking. He still wore the suits, still carried himself with elegance, but inside he was a man undone. His grief was compounded by fear. The Corleonesi had grown too powerful, their reach too wide. Tommaso knew that his name was on their list. Survival was becoming less about loyalty and more about strategy. He fled again, this time to Brazil, seeking distance from the carnage in Palermo. But distance was no cure. The mafia's arm was long, and the grief of losing his sons traveled with him wherever he went. Even in exile, he could not escape the war. The seeds of betrayal were being planted, not betrayal in the traditional sense, born of vengeance or ambition, but betrayal born of loss, of exhaustion, of a man who had given too much and received only pain in return. Tommaso Buscetta, the loyal soldier of Cosa Nostra, was beginning to see that silence had cost him everything. His belief in honor was dissolving, replaced by the quiet, heavy truth that the mafia was nothing more than destruction dressed in ritual. In Palermo, the war continued, claiming lives without mercy. In Brazil, Tommaso waited, watched, and grieved. The man who had once been called the boss of two worlds now found himself between two fates, remain silent and perish, or speak and live. At this stage, he had not yet chosen. But the choice was coming, as certain as the tide, and when it came, it would change the history of the Mafia forever. By the early 1980s, Tommaso Buscetta was a man on the run, not from the law alone, but from fate itself. Palermo had become a graveyard of friends and family, a city where the Corleonesi faction ruled with iron and blood. The old balance of Cosa Nostra was gone, swept away by a wave of violence that spared no one. For Tommaso, exile in Brazil was not just an escape, it was survival. Yet even there, thousands of miles from Sicily, the shadow of death followed him. Brazil had always been a refuge for Buscetta. Its sprawling cities, its bustling ports, and its tangled networks of crime offered him space to operate and a degree of anonymity. He lived under false names, moved between homes, and tried to rebuild fragments of a life far removed from the terror-consuming Palermo. But his heart remained heavy. The deaths of his sons lingered like open wounds, reminders that loyalty to the Mafia had bought him nothing but loss. Each day, he woke knowing that more family members could be killed, that more friends might vanish, that he himself could be next. The Corleonesi did not forgive, and they did not forget. They viewed Buscetta not as a neutral figure, but as a man whose very survival was a threat. To allow him to live meant leaving open the possibility of resistance, and so their reach extended even to Brazil. Violence crept into his refuge. Police pressure followed, too. Buscetta, despite his polished manners and careful diplomacy, was still a marked man in the eyes of international law. In 1983, his fragile refuge collapsed. Brazilian authorities, cooperating with Italian requests, arrested him in Rio de Janeiro. He was living under a false identity, but his past could not be hidden forever. The arrest was not a dramatic shootout. It was, instead, a quiet fall. The once gentleman gangster, always elegant, always composed, found himself in handcuffs, surrounded not by allies but by guards. For Tommaso, this was not just the loss of freedom. It was the confirmation of what he had feared all along. There was nowhere left to run. Extradition to Italy followed, a return not to the homeland of his youth, but to the battlefield of his betrayal. Palermo awaited him not as home, but as a prison. The Italian state had grown more determined in its fight against the Mafia, fueled by public outrage and the escalating violence of the Corleonesi. Judges, prosecutors, and police officers dedicated themselves to dismantling Cosa Nostra, though many paid for their efforts with their lives. Into this climate, Buscetta was delivered, a man with knowledge, with scars, and with nothing left to lose. At first, he resisted. Years of indoctrination could not be erased overnight. Omerta, the code of silence, was not just a rule, it was an identity. To speak was to betray everything he had once been. In prison, he held his tongue, keeping his grief and his knowledge locked inside. He knew that if he spoke, he would sign not only his own death warrant, but possibly doom what remained of his family. And yet, silence felt heavier than words. The Mafia had already taken so much from him. How much more could he give? The turning point came slowly. Isolation, grief, and despair wore him down. His sons' faces haunted him. The friends he had buried returned in dreams. And the hypocrisy of Cosa Nostra, the so-called society of honor, became unbearable. What honor was left in killing children? What tradition justified slaughtering families? Buscetta, who had once believed in the dignity of men of honor, now saw only murderers in fine suits. It was in this state that he encountered Judge Giovanni Falcone. Falcone was unlike the corrupt officials who had long turned a blind eye to the Mafia. He was young, determined, and incorruptible. Soft-spoken but firm, he carried himself with quiet authority. He did not seek Buscetta out with threats or promises of wealth. Instead, he offered something far rarer: respect. For the first time in years, Tommaso faced a man who treated him not as a criminal to be exploited or a pawn to be discarded, but as a human being. Falcone listened. He did not rush, did not pressure. He gave Buscetta the space to speak when he was ready. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence began to crack. At first, it was fragments, memories, observations, names whispered like confessions in the dark. Then, piece by piece, Buscetta began to tell his story. He spoke not as a man seeking revenge, but as a man exhausted by grief. He explained the structure of Cosa Nostra, its rituals, its rules, and its betrayals. He detailed the wars, the killings, the rise of the Corleonesi. For Falcone, this was a revelation. For Italy, it would become a weapon. But in these early conversations, it was something more intimate, the breaking of a lifelong silence. Buscetta was not merely informing, he was unburdening. The words carried years of weight, and with each confession, he shed a little of the burden that had consumed him. Speaking to Falcone was not just betrayal of the Mafia. It was a kind of liberation from the prison of loyalty that had destroyed him. Still, the choice was not without fear. Tommaso knew that by speaking, he condemned himself to a life in hiding, a life where every shadow might hold an assassin. He knew that his family would remain targets. And yet, silence had already cost him everything he valued. Words, though dangerous, offered at least the chance of justice, the possibility of meaning in the ruins of his life. By the mid-1980s, Buscetta had fully broken with Omerta. His testimony would become the cornerstone of the Maxi Trial, the largest anti-mafia prosecution in history. But at this moment, in the quiet rooms where he sat with Judge Falcone, it was not about trials or history books. It was about one man, tired and broken, finally choosing truth over tradition. For Tommaso Buscetta, the gentleman gangster, the boss of two worlds, the loyal soldier, this was the beginning of his final transformation. From silence to speech, from loyalty to betrayal, from man of honor to man of truth. When Tommaso Buscetta first sat across from Judge Giovanni Falcone and chose to speak, few could have imagined the scale of what his words would unleash. For decades, the Mafia had existed in silence, not because it was hidden, but because it was denied. Politicians, police, and even ordinary citizens often spoke of Cosa Nostra as if it were a myth, something whispered about but never proven, a ghostly presence that controlled lives without ever showing its face. To say the word mafia out loud in Italy was, for many, an act of defiance. But now in the mid-1980s, that silence began to break. Buscetta's testimony offered something no investigator had ever held before, an insider's map of Cosa Nostra. He explained the structure of the organization with clarity. Families were not just loose bands of criminals. They were disciplined, hierarchical, and bound by ritual. Bosses, underbosses, capo regime, soldiers, each role had purpose, each decision followed order. And at the heart of it all was the commission, the governing body that resolved disputes and maintained unity among the families. For years, law enforcement had guessed at this structure, but guesses had no weight in court. Buscetta's words transformed speculation into evidence. He named names. He recalled meetings. He described the rituals of initiation, the blood oaths, the pledges of silence. He painted a portrait of Cosa Nostra, not as scattered criminals, but as a government within a government, a shadow state with its own laws, punishments, and loyalties. Judge Falcone listened carefully, taking notes, verifying details, testing the consistency of Buscetta's story. What impressed him most was not just the information, but the way it was delivered. Buscetta did not speak like a man seeking vengeance. He did not shout or dramatize. His words were steady, calm, reflective, like a man recounting a history rather than plotting revenge. This tone gave his testimony power. He sounded not like a traitor inventing stories, but like a wary witness finally telling the truth. The Italian state, for once, listened. Buscetta's confessions became the cornerstone of a case unlike any other, the Maxi Trial. Held in Palermo between 1986 and 1992, the trial was a spectacle of justice on a scale never before attempted. A fortified courthouse was built to house it, designed to withstand bombs and protect the judges, prosecutors, and witnesses. Inside, hundreds of defendants faced charges ranging from murder to drug trafficking, extortion to conspiracy. For Italy, it was not just a trial, it was a reckoning. In that courtroom, the ghosts of silence were dragged into the light. Buscetta's testimony linked the names of men long rumored to be untouchable. Politicians who had denied the Mafia's existence could no longer look away. Ordinary citizens, many of whom had lived under Mafia fear their entire lives, finally saw that the state was willing to confront the beast head on. The proceedings lasted years, filling volumes of testimony, evidence, and cross-examinations. Yet, for all the grandeur of the trial, the heart of it lay in the quiet words of one man. Buscetta did not claim to be a hero. He admitted his crimes openly. He did not seek absolution. Instead, he explained himself as a man who had lost too much to remain silent. His betrayal, he insisted, was not vengeance but exhaustion. He had buried sons, seen friends slaughtered, and watched the Mafia transform from a society of supposed honor into a machine of indiscriminate murder. If silence had once been a code, it had now become unbearable. Speaking was all he had left. The defense, of course, tried to discredit him. Lawyers called him a liar, a traitor, a man speaking only to save his own life. They argued that his testimony was colored by personal grudges, that his grief had turned into bitterness. But Buscetta's consistency, his detailed memory, and his calm delivery made him credible. And with Falcone's careful guidance, his words stood firm under the weight of cross-examination. Outside the courtroom, the world watched. Newspapers printed headlines about the pentito, the Mafia turncoat who had dared to speak. Some hailed him as brave, others cursed him as the ultimate betrayer. Within Cosa Nostra, his name was now poison. He was condemned to death, hunted by killers who would stop at nothing to silence him. But under state protection, he survived, moving constantly, living with the knowledge that every day was borrowed time. The Maxi Trial concluded with convictions on a historic scale. Hundreds of mafiosi were sentenced to prison. For the first time in Italian history, the state had struck a blow against Cosa Nostra that could not be ignored. The Mafia, though far from destroyed, had been wounded publicly and deeply, and at the center of that wound was the testimony of Tommaso Buscetta. But if the trial was a triumph, it was also a warning. The Mafia did not forgive defeats. Judges, prosecutors, and police officers who had dared to confront it lived under constant threat. Many, including Falcone himself, would pay with their lives. Buscetta, too, would remain a marked man until his final days. Speaking had freed him from silence, but it had also condemned him to a lifetime of fear. For Italy, however, the Maxi Trial was a turning point. It proved that the Mafia was not invincible. It showed that silence could be broken, that truth could be spoken even against an empire of shadows. And for Buscetta, though he remained haunted by grief and hunted by enemies, it offered something close to meaning. His words had changed history. His betrayal had given birth to justice. Yet justice is never simple, never clean. Even as the convictions rolled in, Sicily remained scarred. The Mafia adapted, adjusted, and continued to exist in new forms. Buscetta knew this. He knew that no testimony, no trial, could erase centuries of corruption and fear. But he also knew that silence had been broken forever, and that, perhaps, was enough. In the quiet of his later reflections, Buscetta would describe himself not as a hero, but as a man who could no longer endure the weight of lies. His betrayal was not an act of courage in his own eyes, but an act of survival, a final attempt to give shape to the losses that had consumed him. And in doing so, he became something he never intended, the first crack in the Mafia's wall of silence, a whisper that grew into thunder in the court of shadows. The Maxi Trial was over, but for Tommaso Buscetta, there was no return to ordinary life. Victory in the courtroom had not ended the war, it had merely shifted the battlefield. Hundreds of mafiosi were sentenced, and the state had, at last, proven its will to confront Cosa Nostra. Yet every conviction was a wound dealt to men who never forgave, never forgot. For the Mafia, Buscetta was now the ultimate betrayer, the man whose words had pierced the veil of silence that protected them for generations. And so, the rest of his life became one of hiding. He entered witness protection, moving from place to place, country to country. The man who once stood proudly in Palermo's streets and Rio's nightclubs now lived behind layers of secrecy. False identities replaced his name. Safe houses replaced his home. Guards and handlers became his constant companions. Buscetta had traded silence for truth, but truth carried a price: exile. In those years, his relationship with Judge Giovanni Falcone deepened into something profound. Falcone was not just the man who had listened to his words. He became, in many ways, the custodian of Buscetta's second life. Their bond was unusual, a former mafioso and a magistrate, once enemies by nature, now tied by trust. Falcone respected Buscetta, not because he had been a criminal, but because he had chosen to break the code that enslaved so many. Buscetta respected Falcone for his courage, for his incorruptibility, and for the quiet strength with which he bore the burden of justice. They spoke often. Falcone asked questions not with arrogance, but with patience, always seeking clarity, always cross-checking details. He wanted not just testimony, but truth that would stand unshaken in court. Buscetta, in turn, opened up in ways he had never done with anyone else. He revealed the inner workings of the Mafia with precision, but also with sorrow. He described betrayals, alliances, and murderers not as stories of triumph, but as scars. With Falcone, he could speak both as a witness and as a grieving father, a man hollowed out by loss. But even as their partnership strengthened, the dangers around them multiplied. The Mafia had been wounded by the Maxi Trial, but it was far from defeated. The Corleonesi, led by Tot Rina, tightened their grip on Cosa Nostra with unrelenting cruelty. Their message to the state was clear: justice would be answered with blood. Judges, prosecutors, police officers, and even politicians who dared to stand against them were placed on death lists. Sicily entered a new era of fear, one where bombs replaced bullets and massacres replaced warnings. Buscetta, though hidden, felt the weight of this violence. He knew the Mafia's methods all too well. He knew that Falcone, his protector and ally, was a marked man. Every conversation they had carried the shadow of danger. Falcone moved under heavy guard, lived behind layers of security, yet still carried himself with quiet dignity. He never complained, never wavered. But Buscetta understood that Cosa Nostra would stop at nothing. That shadow became reality on May 23, 1992. On that day, Giovanni Falcone, his wife Francesca Morvillo, and 3 police escorts were killed in a massive bombing near Capaci on the road from Palermo's airport. The explosion tore the highway apart, a display of violence so brutal it shook Italy to its core. Falcone, the man who had devoted his life to truth, was silenced by the very silence he had sought to break. For Buscetta, the news was devastating. He had lost many people in his life, sons, friends, allies, but Falcone's death struck differently. This was not just another casualty of mafia violence. This was the loss of a man who had represented hope, dignity, and the possibility of a different future. Falcone had believed in him when no one else did. He had given meaning to Buscetta's betrayal, turning confession into history, silence into testimony. With Falcone gone, Buscetta felt the ground beneath him crack once again. The assassination of Falcone marked one of the darkest chapters in Italy's fight against Cosa Nostra. The country mourned not just a magistrate, but a symbol of resistance. Crowds filled the streets in grief and outrage. Politicians who had once turned a blind eye were forced to acknowledge the mafia's war against the state. And yet, for all the sorrow, there was also a spark of resolve. Falcone's death did not end the fight. It ignited it. His colleague and friend, Paulo Borsellino, stepped forward with renewed determination, though he too would fall to mafia bombs only weeks later. Buscetta, hidden far from Sicily, could do nothing but watch from the shadows. His testimony had helped build the case that made Falcone a target. In that sense, he felt the guilt of survival, the burden of being alive, while those who had defended him were killed. Yet he also knew that Falcone's legacy was larger than one life. The seeds they had planted together, the truth about Cosa Nostra's structure, the proof of its power, could not be erased by a bomb. Silence had been broken, and no amount of violence could return Italy to ignorance. Still, survival weighed heavily on him. Witness protection kept him physically safe, but it could not shield him from grief. He lived in the paradox of freedom without peace. The mafia hunted him, but it was his memories that tormented him most. Nights were long, haunted by visions of his sons, by the echoes of Palermo's streets, by the face of Falcone smiling faintly in memory. In public, Buscetta was both reviled and praised. To the mafia, he was a traitor beyond forgiveness. To many Italians, he was a necessary witness, the man whose words had torn open the mafia's mask. But to himself, he was something else entirely, a man who had lost too much to remain silent, yet too broken to find comfort in speaking. His betrayal had changed history, but it had not healed his wounds. As Italy continued its fight, Buscetta remained in the shadows, alive but invisible. His voice had shaken the foundations of Cosa Nostra, yet he lived as a ghost, moving, hiding, always looking over his shoulder. Justice had come, but at a cost so high it often felt unbearable. And in the quiet spaces of his exile, he carried the heavy truth silence had once protected him, and speech had condemned him. Between the two, there was no peace. After Giovanni Falcone's death, Tommaso Buscetta's world grew even quieter. He had chosen truth, but truth had forced him into an existence that felt less like living and more like drifting. The Italian state kept its promise, protection, anonymity, survival. But survival came at a price that few outside his circle could ever understand. He was moved far from Sicily, far from Brazil, far from the lands that once defined him. His new home was the United States, a country vast enough to hide him, yet strange enough to remind him every day of how far he had fallen from his old life. In the mafia, he had been respected, feared, even admired for his elegance, his charisma, his charm. He had worn tailored suits, walked with confidence, carried himself like a man who belonged. Now, under witness protection, he lived in plain clothes, in ordinary houses, under names that felt borrowed, never truly his own. The program offered security, but not dignity. For men like Buscetta, whose lives had been built on reputation and honor, however twisted that honor may have been. The erasure of identity was a kind of death. He was alive, yes, but invisible. He could no longer walk the streets of Palermo, where neighbors whispered his name, nor sit in Rio's cafes where old friends greeted him with a nod. He was, in every way, a ghost. His family life bore the deepest scars. Some of his children had been murdered long before his betrayal, victims of mafia revenge. Others struggled with the consequences of his choices, forced to live under assumed names, their own lives reshaped by decisions they had never made. For Buscetta, fatherhood had always been a fractured thing, but now it became a source of constant torment. His betrayal had protected the state? Yes, but it had destroyed what remained of his bloodline's safety. The grief never left him. In the stillness of his American exile, Buscetta often reflected on what had driven him to speak in the first place. He had not confessed out of vengeance, nor for glory. He had spoken because he could no longer bear the hypocrisy of silence. The mafia he had once believed in, a brotherhood bound by rules, by loyalty, by codes of respect, no longer existed. In its place stood an organization consumed by greed and bloodlust, led by men who killed without reason and destroyed without restraint. Betraying that mafia had felt less like treachery and more like mourning. But reflection brought little peace. The United States, for all its safety, was not home. He lived in suburban houses with blinds drawn, where neighbors never truly knew who lived beside them. He made trips under escort, his movements restricted, his freedom reduced to careful routines. Every sound, every knock on the door, every unfamiliar face on the street could send a wave of paranoia through him. He had chosen survival. But survival felt like captivity, and yet, despite the loneliness, Buscetta remained a man of contradictions. He still took pride in his appearance, dressing carefully even when there was no audience to admire him. He still carried himself with a quiet dignity, as though he refused to let the mafia, or even witness protection, strip him entirely of who he had been. In private moments, he allowed himself small luxuries, a fine wine, a well-tailored shirt, a memory of Palermo's sunsets, tokens of a life that could never return. The American authorities valued him not only for his testimony in Italy, but also for what he could offer about international drug trafficking. In the 1980s and 1990s, as the mafia expanded its reach across continents, Buscetta's knowledge remained valuable. He became, unwillingly, a consultant to justice. Each time he spoke, though, he was reminded of the danger his words carried. Each detail he revealed deepened the mafia's hatred for him, ensuring that he could never, under any circumstances, resurface as Tommaso Buscetta the man. In public memory, he was both reviled and respected. To Cosa Nostra, he was the traitor of traitors, a man who had violated the most sacred code of all Omerta, the vow of silence. To many Italians, he was the man who had given them the truth, who had confirmed what they had always suspected, but could never prove. To historians and journalists, he became a symbol of paradox. A mafioso who sought justice, a criminal who revealed crime, a betrayer who also, in his own way, was loyal to something larger than himself. But in his own eyes, Buscetta was neither hero nor villain. He was simply tired. Tired of blood, tired of lies, tired of living in a world where every friendship could turn into betrayal, and every son could become a target. He once told investigators that his choice was not about morality, but exhaustion. "I could not carry it anymore," he said, and perhaps that was his truest confession. As years passed, the mafia in Sicily shifted and evolved, but Buscetta's story remained etched in its history. He had been the first high-ranking insider to truly break Omerta, the first to expose the commission, the first to force Italy to see the mafia not as rumor, but as reality. Others would follow, other pentiti, other voices. But Buscetta's betrayal was the one that cracked the wall. And once a wall is cracked, it can never be whole again. In his American exile, though, history offered him little comfort. He lived with bodyguards under assumed names, often moving from one coast to another. Sometimes he blended into the anonymity of a crowd. Other times he remained isolated, unable to risk being recognized. The irony was bitter. A man once known for his charisma now lived unseen. A man once surrounded by networks of power now walked alone. At night, when the world was quiet, he would replay his memories. The streets of Palermo, the laughter of sons long gone, the tense but respectful voice of Giovanni Falcone, and the silence that had defined so much of his life. First as a code to be obeyed, then as a wound to be broken, and finally as the emptiness that surrounded him in exile. Tommaso Buscetta had become a ghost, not because he was forgotten, but because he could never again truly live as himself. He had chosen to speak, and in doing so, he had erased his past. What remained was survival, a shadow life in a shadow world where the only constant was memory. The years passed slowly for Tommaso Buscetta. Time, once filled with the rush of deals, the rhythm of Palermo's streets, and the tension of survival within Cosa Nostra, now moved in quiet, indistinguishable days. In witness protection, the clock was less about hours and more about waiting. Waiting for new instructions, waiting for the next move, waiting for an end that never seemed to arrive. But age has a way of softening even the hardest edges. By the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Buscetta was no longer the sharp-dressed man of the Mafia's golden years. The once polished suits, the confident stride, the magnetic presence, all faded into the figure of an older man, still dignified, but carrying the weight of survival in his posture. His health began to decline. Illness crept into his life the way shadows lengthen in the evening, slowly and inevitably. Illness did not frighten him. Death had been his companion for decades. He had lived surrounded by it, escaped it countless times, watched it take those he loved most. What weighed heavier on him was not his own mortality, but the legacy he would leave behind. How would the world remember Tommaso Buscetta? As a traitor, as a man of courage, as a criminal, or as something in between? In his quiet reflections, he often circled back to the contradictions of his life. He had once believed in honor among thieves, in the idea that Cosa Nostra was not just crime but tradition, a structure of rules and loyalty. That belief had carried him through his youth, through exile in Brazil, through prison cells and dark alleys. But the mafia that had killed his sons, that had bombed highways to silence men like Giovanni Falcone, was no longer the brotherhood he had once joined. It had become, in his eyes, a monster devouring its own. To betray it had not been betrayal of honor, but betrayal of something already corrupt. Still, he knew history would not be kind. For every person who saw him as a necessary witness, there were others who spat on his name. To the Mafia, he was unforgivable. To many Italians, he remained complicit in decades of bloodshed. He had never claimed innocence, and he never denied the crimes of his youth. What he insisted upon, quietly but firmly, was that his testimony had meaning. Without it, silence would still reign. Without it, men like Falcone would have had no weapon to fight with. In exile, he sometimes allowed journalists and writers brief glimpses into his story. Always careful, always measured, he spoke not to glorify, but to explain. His voice, once commanding in the underworld, became softer, tinged with wariness. He did not boast about his past. He reflected on it like a man burdened by memory. His interviews were not confessions of pride, but testaments of fatigue. He reminded the world that his decision to speak had not been about revenge. It had been about exhaustion, about being too tired to keep carrying the weight of silence. Buscetta's later years were filled with this tension between visibility and invisibility. In public records and headlines, he was a man whose betrayal had shaken history. In daily life, he was just another old man moving quietly through safe houses, sitting at kitchen tables, waiting for night to fall. Witness protection had stripped him of audience, but not of memory. He carried Palermo in his bones, Brazil in his veins, and loss in his heart. By the end, his health left him frail, yet his mind remained sharp. He could still recall with painful clarity the hierarchy of Cosa Nostra, the betrayals that had torn it apart, the faces of his children, the sound of Falcone's voice. His memories were both his wealth and his torment. They gave him purpose when speaking to investigators, but they also haunted him in the silence of long nights. He once admitted, in one of his final reflections, that he had never seen himself as a hero. Heroes were men like Falcone and Borsellino, who faced death with courage and without compromise. He was, by his own account, something else entirely. A survivor, a man who had endured too much, lost too much, and chosen truth because it was the only thing left to choose. If history wanted to call him a traitor, so be it. If it wanted to call him a witness, he would accept that too. In the end, he did not seek absolution. He sought only to be understood. When death finally approached in 2000, it came not by bullet, not by bomb, not by mafia vendetta, but by natural illness. Tommaso Buscetta died in the United States, far from the streets where his story had begun. For a man who had lived so long under the threat of assassination, to die quietly was its own kind of irony. Cosa Nostra had wanted him erased violently, spectacularly. Instead, he slipped away quietly, as if even death respected his desire for silence at last. In Italy, his passing was met with mixed emotions. Some dismissed him as a criminal who deserved no sympathy. Others acknowledged the enormity of his role in history. For the Mafia, his death was almost anticlimactic. The enemy they had hunted for years had vanished without their hand. For the state, it was the closing of a chapter. And for those who still whispered his name at night, it was a reminder that one man's choice to speak had changed everything. Tommaso Buscetta's legacy remains unsettled, suspended between betrayal and truth. He was a man who broke silence, but also a man who carried guilt. He was a father who could not protect his sons, a mafioso who turned against the mafia, a ghost who lived long enough to see his truth reshape the world he once belonged to. His life was not a story of redemption, but a fracture, a man torn between two codes, two loyalties, two silences. In the end, his name lingers in history not because he was perfect, but because he was the first to speak when no one else dared. His betrayal was quiet, his grief louder than his words. And though he lived the last of his years as a ghost, his voice still echoes, reminding us that even in the darkest of worlds, silence can be broken, and truth, however heavy, can be spoken. When Tommaso Buscetta chose to speak, he could not have imagined how far the echo of his words would travel. At first, it seemed like one man's testimony, one voice breaking a code older than his own lifetime. But as time passed, that echo grew louder, spreading beyond the walls of the courtroom, beyond the streets of Palermo, and into the consciousness of an entire nation. Before Buscetta, the Mafia was an open secret. Everyone knew it existed, but few dared to name it. Politicians denied its power. Journalists who spoke too boldly were silenced. Ordinary citizens whispered about it in fear, passing stories like shadows in the night. Even the word mafia carried danger, as though to say it aloud was to invite its gaze. The state had struggled for decades to pin down its structure, to transform suspicion into proof. Buscetta changed that forever. His testimony during the Maxi Trial was not just a list of crimes. It was a blueprint. He explained the commission, the chain of command, the rules and rituals that bound families together. For the first time, the Mafia was no longer a rumor, but a system, described in detail by someone who had lived within it. Judges, police, and prosecutors now had language and structure to confront what they had always fought blindly. His betrayal had turned shadows into outlines, whispers into evidence, and with his example came others. Buscetta became the first high-ranking mafioso to break omertà, the sacred vow of silence. But once he did, others followed. Men who might have stayed loyal began to reconsider. If a figure as respected as Buscetta could betray Cosa Nostra, then perhaps the code was not unbreakable. Perhaps silence was not destiny. Over the years, more and more pentiti stepped forward, offering confessions, testimonies, and insights. Each one added to the erosion of Cosa Nostra's invincibility. The wall of silence cracked wider, piece by piece, until it could no longer hold. Of course, the Mafia adapted. It always did. New leaders rose, new strategies were adopted. New forms of power emerged. But something fundamental had shifted. No longer could rely entirely on silence as their shield. Every betrayal reminded them that loyalty was fragile, that fear could no longer guarantee obedience. Buscetta had shown that even the deepest bonds could break under grief and exhaustion. In this way, his betrayal weakened the very foundation of Cosa Nostra, not just its structure, but its mythology. Italy itself changed too. The Maxi Trial, fueled by Buscetta's testimony, forced the nation to confront what had long been ignored. The Mafia was not just a criminal nuisance. It was a parallel power, a shadow state with reach into politics, business, and daily life. The convictions proved that the state could fight back, that justice was not always powerless, and when Falcone and Borsellino were killed, the outrage that followed pushed Italy into a new era of anti-mafia resolve. Buscetta's betrayal also influenced law enforcement far beyond Sicily. Internationally, governments studied the Maxi Trial as a model for tackling organized crime. The idea that insiders could provide the key to dismantling criminal organizations became a strategy applied in battles against cartels, gangs, and syndicates around the world. The principle was simple but profound. To understand an empire of crime, you needed the voice of someone who had lived inside it. Yet the echo of betrayal was not only strategic, it was personal. Within Cosa Nostra, Buscetta's name became a curse, a symbol of unforgivable treachery. His story was told as a warning to others. Betrayal meant eternal exile, endless fear and death if ever caught. But the very fact that he had survived long enough to speak, to live years beyond his betrayal, also planted a dangerous idea in the minds of other mafiosi. It showed that breaking silence was possible, that survival, though lonely, was not impossible. This duality haunted Cosa Nostra, eroding its most sacred myth. In the eyes of the public, Buscetta remained a paradox. Some hailed him as a man who gave Italy the truth it desperately needed. Others despised him, arguing that a criminal can never be trusted, that his testimony was less about justice and more about self-preservation. To many, he was neither hero nor villain, but something far more unsettling, a man who forced the world to see the Mafia for what it truly was. The cultural impact of his betrayal ran deep. Films, books, and documentaries retold his story, shaping him into a symbol larger than life. The man who betrayed the Mafia became a phrase etched into history, even as his real life remained hidden in anonymity. He had wanted survival, not fame, yet his legacy could never escape the public gaze. In the collective memory, Buscetta lived on as both ghost and giant, a figure who had altered history while vanishing into its margins. The Mafia, wounded by betrayal and weakened by trials, never disappeared entirely, but it was never the same after Buscetta. Its grip loosened, its aura of invincibility cracked. The code of Omerta, once untouchable, now carried the memory of the man who broke it. For generations to come, his name would be invoked not as a warning against betrayal, but as proof that even the darkest silence could be broken. And perhaps that is why his betrayal continues to matter. Not because it ended the Mafia. It did not. Not because it redeemed his past. It could not. But because it shifted the balance of fear. For centuries, silence had been the Mafia's greatest weapon. Tommaso Buscetta, weary and broken, dared to surrender it. His betrayal echoed through the world like a crack in stone, small at first, but impossible to repair. In the end, the legacy of his choice is not only about law or justice. It is about humanity, the breaking point of a man who had lost too much, endured too much, and finally found that silence was heavier than truth. His story reminds us that even in the heart of darkness, there comes a moment when silence can no longer hold. And when that silence breaks, the echo travels far beyond the man who first spoke. Every story must find its ending, though some endings arrive quietly, without applause or final judgment. The life of Tommaso Buscetta was one such story. It began in the narrow streets of Palermo, where poverty and pride shaped him. It stretched across continents, from Sicily to Brazil to the United States, shadowed by crime, loss, and exile. And it ended not with the roar of violence, but with a whisper, the kind of silence that follows when a man has finally said all he can say. Buscetta's legacy is tangled, impossible to capture in a single word. To Cosa Nostra, he was il traditore, the traitor whose name would never be forgiven. To the Italian state, he was the witness who turned suspicion into truth. To historians, he was the first high-ranking mafioso to truly break the code of silence, to reveal that the Mafia was not just myth but structure, discipline, and shadow power. And to himself, he was something simpler, a man who had carried too much grief to remain silent any longer. The betrayal he carried out was not loud, not dramatic, not born from vengeance. It was quiet, weary, almost reluctant. It came not from a desire to destroy, but from an inability to endure. In his heart, Buscetta had already lost everything that bound him to Cosa Nostra, his sons, his sense of loyalty, his belief in honor. What remained was only truth and the act of speaking it. That truth shook the Mafia's foundation. It led to the Maxi Trial, to hundreds of convictions, to the first true acknowledgement that Cosa Nostra was more than rumor. It inspired others to break silence, to testify, to step into the light. It gave Giovanni Falcone the weapon he needed, though it also made him a target. And it marked the beginning of a new chapter in Italy's long, painful struggle against organized crime. But for Buscetta himself, the triumphs of justice were shadowed by the loneliness of exile. He lived as a ghost in America, protected but invisible, remembered but hidden. His death came quietly, by illness, leaving behind no headlines of violence, no final act of Mafia revenge. It was perhaps the only peace he could have hoped for after a life defined by turmoil. And so when we look back at his story, what do we see? A criminal who betrayed his brothers, a father who failed to protect his sons, a man who, at the edge of despair, chose to speak, or perhaps all of these at once. For Tommaso Buscetta was never simple. He was a man of contradictions, as human as he was flawed. His story is not one of redemption, nor of glory, but of fracture, of the breaking of a silence that had held for generations. There is something deeply human in that fracture, We live in worlds built on codes, traditions, expectations. We carry loyalties, even when they wound us. But every man has a breaking point, a moment when the weight of silence becomes heavier than the risk of truth. For Buscetta, that moment came after burying his children, after watching his world collapse, after realizing that the mafia he once revered was gone, replaced by cruelty without honor. His betrayal was not a choice of strength, but of necessity, the only act left for a man who had lost everything. In the end, his life reminds us that betrayal and truth are not opposites. Sometimes they are the same thing. Sometimes, to betray one world is the only way to remain faithful to another, to the memory of lost sons, to the faint hope of justice, to the belief that silence must eventually break. That is why his story still matters. Not because it paints him as a hero, he never was one. Not because it excuses his crimes, he never asked for forgiveness. But because it shows us that even in the darkest systems of power, truth can emerge from exhaustion, from grief, from the quiet decision of a single man to finally speak. Tommaso Buscetta will always be remembered as the man who betrayed the mafia. Yet behind that title lies something deeper, the image of an aging man, weary, broken, sitting across from a judge, speaking not with anger but with sorrow. A man whose voice reshaped history, even as it condemned him to live as a ghost. A man who showed that betrayal, when born of truth, can be an act not of vengeance, but of survival. And so, the story closes. The streets of Palermo remain, the mafia endures in new forms, the fight against silence continues. But the whisper of Tommaso Buscetta lingers still, a reminder that every wall of secrecy can be cracked, every silence can be broken, every shadow can be named. It is a story not of glory but of grief, not of vengeance but of exhaustion. A story for quiet nights and reflective minds. And perhaps, as the lights dim and sleep approaches, that is how it should be remembered. Not as the roar of a gangster, but as the quiet betrayal of a man who could no longer carry silence.